There's a certain magic to the mountains. All mountains are different, but they all have that magic. The crisp, cold, clean air just waits to be breathed in. It's full of the quiet sounds of life. The wind rustles the trees, birds chirp cheerful greetings to one another. There's snow to be found even in June, and it's not the pure and bright kind, but rather more of a dull and dirty snow, like a once white blanket browning with age. The mountains themselves make their presence known long before one can feel their silent magic. They appear in the distance, on the horizon, like the promise of an adventure just begging to be had. No one mountain is the same as another, nor are they singular. Each mountain is somehow connected to another, as if they share people's fear of being truly alone in their secluded worlds. They share trees with one another that smell of sweet sap, and animals that scurry and climb across their surfaces. They share their world with one another, because a life not shared is a life not lived. My mother always loved the mountains. She would pile all of her babies into the van, 4 of us in total, and drive us across the country to reach the mystical mountains every year. Some years we went to Half Dome and El Capitan of Yosemite National Park in California and watched closely to see if we could spot any brave souls scaling the side of Half Dome's peak. Other years we visited Glacier in Montana and its Heaven's Peak before making the trek from our campsite to Lake McDonald. Wherever we went, my mother loved the mountains. She always said she thought better when surrounded by the silent peaks. She also said she never felt more complete than when she was there in the mountains. I grew to love them as well, and I found myself looking for the wholeness my mother felt. She would sometimes say that the mountains were her soulmate, that no one understood her quite like they did. Mountains did not ask questions, nor did they try to give advice or answers. They simply were. Mother always just wanted to be as the mountains did. As I grew older and busier, I began skipping the annual road trips with my family in order to catch up on school or work. My mother went every year, however, without fail, to one park or another. One year in high school I did not go because my friends had invited me to their lake house for the summer. That summer she came home and told me that the mountains missed me. She said that the birds sang songs about my old adventures and that the mountains wept as they heard them. The next year I went back. The year I finally found what my mother had was a year after my father left. I was 18 and about to go to college. He had been separated from my mom for quite some time, and they had finalized their divorce a few years prior, but this was the year he had finally packed his bags and moved far away from me and my family mentally as well as physically. I told myself that I didn't care. I was used to him disappointing me and leaving me. He had missed my senior musical to travel to Tennessee for a friend's birthday rather than stay for me. He hardly ever talked to me, and he didn't know me at all. His leaving was expected. It shouldn't bother me. It had been coming for quite some time. I had everyone around me fooled, and I had almost managed to convince myself that I didn't care. That year I traveled alone with my mother, because my younger sister was busy with high school and my older brothers had college and work. They didn't understand the mountains like my mother did, and like I came to understand them. We sat in the car on the eternal trip through Montana to Glacier, quietly observing the scenery as it passed by. First, the stretches of green pasture that were uneven in places, filled with cows that chewed lazily at the grass. Then came the desert, or at least what I felt like was desert, with fewer plants and far more dry dirt. Finally, my mother pointed ahead and traced the outline of the mountains on the horizon that promised me adventures. I stayed awake and alert, keeping my gaze trained on my mountains as they slowly grew larger and larger, occasionally tracing them with the tip of my finger. Once we arrived, my mother and I set up our tents in the campsite, surrounded by our mountains and trees. The air was clear, and my loud mind quieted itself, as if surprised that it no longer had to shout above the rest of the busy world to get my attention. Mom and I made a small fire and stationed our chairs around it as we read by flashlight, every once in a while shifting when the gray smoke felt a little too friendly. After a bit, I shut my book, turned off my flashlight, and looked up at the infinite stars above my head that were framed by the leaves of the trees. I breathed in that mountain and air and listened to those mountain sounds. I felt part of it all. The world that continued even when I left and forgot about it. The world that wept as it remembered me, because it did remember me, and it always kept my place waiting for my return. I felt so complete and whole in a world that was constantly moving and singing, that somehow continuously stood still. I cried. I cried because I was angry at my father and hurt by him. I cried because life is so busy and stressful and so very loud. I cried because I constantly felt lost, with no hope of being rescued. I cried because my mountains waited for me, and they saved my place for me. My mountains understood me without even having to ask. My mountains told me without expressly telling me that it was okay to feel lost, because lost is always what comes right before found. My mountains cried with me and for me because they loved me. I cried because I felt whole again, sitting among my mountains.